So the Coddling of American Mind was about overprotecting in the real world and the anxious generation about underprotecting online. What has the journey been to writing this book?
So the journey, it comes directly out of the coddling. So Greg and I published The Coddling of the American Mind, the book, in September of 2018. And immediately some psychologists and psychiatrists challenged us and said, there's no epidemic of teen mental illness. It's just an illusion. It's another moral panic. Young people, they're just very comfortable saying that they're depressed and anxious, but that's a good thing. They're honest about it. And so I was like, wait, did we get this wrong? Like, I really have to look into this. And so I started putting together these Google documents to collect all of the data I could find in the United States and the UK, and then later have expanded it to many countries. And then others challenged us because we said very gingerly in the book, we said, social media and phones, the timing is exactly right. Like, we don't know, correlation doesn't imply causation, but maybe smartphones and social media also contributed to this. And we said that very tentatively. And then some people said, you're doing moral panic again. There's no evidence. It's just correlational.
Yeah.
And so I created another Google document. These are all public Google documents. If you go to jonathanhaidt.com/supplements, jonathanhaidt.com/reviews. I have dozens of these open source literature reviews because I couldn't keep it all straight in my head. And once I put it all together, like, one document shows it is I hate to catastrophize, but it is a tidal wave. It is an epidemic of mental illness. It hit kids in all the English-speaking countries in 2013, plus or minus a year. It hit girls especially hard in the same way. Rates of self-harm and hospitalization for self-harm skyrocketed for girls in all the English-speaking countries at the same time. There is no other explanation for this. No one has come up with even with a theory to explain it other than to come back to our story. I was looking at the epidemic and then looking at the evidence that it is tied to social media and smartphone use. And so I began debating with people, and I would do this very publicly, and I would put things out there, and I would invite criticism. And this is something I learned from studying moral psychology. If you ask the world to make you smarter, they will. Just say, you put it out, and people, and Twitter is actually really good for this. You put something out, people will call you all kinds of names, but they'll raise all kinds of problems, and most of the objections are not relevant, but some are. So, as I refined my view and got more and more confident, okay, this is a huge epidemic. It's international. And here, this is work done with Zachary Rausch, my research assistant, my lead researcher, who's done an amazing job tracing it out over many countries. Once we were solid on the evidence that it's international, it starts around 2013, and it's very closely linked to social media. I decided actually to write about this more. Originally, it was going to be one big book about how social media is damaging teen mental health in the first chapter, and then I was going to go on to democracy, because that's a whole other thing that we haven't talked about, is what social media has done to liberal democracies. But once I started writing that book, it was going to be called Life After Babel, Adapting to a World We May Never Again Share. And I wrote chapter 1, which was going to be, look what happened to the kids. They're the first ones who went on. Look what happened. Now let's look at democracy. That chapter was so shocking. And it was like, oh my God, like, I can't just say, look at the disaster. Now let's talk. It's like, okay, why did this happen? So I had to say, well, you have to look at childhood. What is it that children have to do during childhood? And how is it that a phone-based life stops them from doing that? And then I had to have a whole chapter on girls, because girls are uniquely suffering. But I couldn't leave out the boys. The boys' story is different, and it's a little more complicated. So anyway, by the time I had 4 chapters, I realized, wait, this has to be its own book. And so I made that decision in, I think, the fall of 2022, and then wrote The Anxious Generation in the 12 or 14 months after that. But now to pick up, just to summarize, sorry, I left it hanging. What's the theory? What caused it? The explanation that we offer, that Zach and I offer in the book, and this is also Jean Twenge is another collaborator who's crucial here, and she was the first one on the case. The theory is that from millions of years BC through around 1990, kids had a play-based childhood, like all mammals. All mammals have to play. That's what we have to do to wire up our gigantic brains. So we had a play-based childhood, but in the 90s, we began freaking out in America and in Britain and in Canada. We freak out about child abduction and child molestation. We start keeping our kids inside, just as technology is luring them inside, because now everyone's got a computer, you got video games. Every year the video games are better. So the kids are leaving real world experience. They're not seeing each other as much anymore. They're not going outside. They're not going into nature. They're not being independent. They're always at home, much more often at home in front of a screen. And that goes on from 1990 to 2010. But mental health isn't falling in this period, actually. It's actually pretty stable. And the kids are on flip phones.
Yeah.
And a flip phone is very useful for communicating with your friends.
Yeah.
And it's not useful for broadcasting to the world. You can't do that with a flip phone. So in 2010, very few kids have an iPhone. It came out in 2017. It's 2007. It's still expensive. So in 2010, very few kids have an iPhone. In 2015, the great majority of kids do. So between 2010 and 2015, we went from flip phone with low-speed internet and no apps to iPhone with a high-speed internet, unlimited data plan, and 1 million apps, especially Instagram. Facebook buys Instagram in 2012. That's the year that the huge publicity, that's when all the girls get on, is 2012. And 2013 is when their mental health falls off a cliff.